Hello everyone, I'm Renaud Beauchard and this is Tout le monde sait on Tocsin Plus. And I'm very pleased to host one of my favorite people in the world actually. It's the American novelist, screenwriter, and independent journalist. He's an icon actually of independent journalism. And Walter wrote several Walter Kirn. So Walter wrote several novels, two of them actually translated into French, Blood Will Out, and Up in the Air, which was adapted for the big screen with George Clooney.
Yeah.
Um,
Blood Will Out is not a novel. It's not a work of fiction.
it's
It's actually a true memoir, a factual account of my friendship with a con man and murderer who had been my friend for years, and I hadn't suspected his real identity or his evil nature.
well, he was his nickname was Clark Rockefeller, I think. That's like, I mean, if I
Yes,
remember correctly.
that's the name he gave himself, and he when I knew him, was supposedly an aristocrat and a fine gentleman. But after I had been his friend for 10 years, police investigation revealed that he was also a multiple murderer.
Wow, this is. In fact, I have to confess that's one of those I have not read. But however, I read your amazing autobiography, which is called "Lost in the Meritocracy," subtitled "The Under Education of an Overachiever," and this is really an amazing book. So I really hope that if there is a publisher listening to us, that he will seize upon the opportunity because this is an amazing book.
Well, I did too, and that was for your listeners and viewers, a book about my education, my formal education from age 4 until I went to Princeton University, and its theme was all the ways in which I learned to cheat at life, but I didn't learn the realities of either history, literature, or anything. I just learned to socially advance myself. And I hope I have corrected that problem since. But at age 22, I came out of the American education system a very flexible
Hmm.
and charismatic ignoramus who didn't know much.
And you were saved by Mark Twain. That was your
That's
first
true.
escape from it.
That's exactly true. I started reading Mark Twain after my education had failed to actually educate me. And that was the beginning of real knowledge and wisdom and so on. So that's that book sort of compressed.
Well, we'll get more into this topic of the elite and the overachievers, and I just wanted to mention as well that you are also the editor at large of that amazing publication. This is like, I mean, my favorite publication to give as a gift. It's called County Highway, and it actually influenced it's by the kind of publications in which Mark Twain was writing in the 19th century. You know.
That's exactly correct. It is not available online. It exists only as a printed newspaper. Its aesthetic and its style, visually, graphically, is based on the newspapers of the late 19th century that Mark Twain would have written for. Um, and it's actually, though it looks like a newspaper, a literary magazine full of nonfiction stories about life in America outside of the cosmopolitan centers. But though it appears to be almost a nostalgia style paper, it really isn't. We have broken real news, this big story in America about the sort of frauds in Minnesota based around the Somali immigrant community were broken by us last November, and then the top New York Times and others followed up. So it's a combination of literary evocations of America, that maybe would have made de Tocqueville proud,
Mhm.
and real news. And we're very proud of it. Thank you.
I'm glad you are mentioning Alexis Tocqueville because I think you represent exactly the kind of Americans that the reason why he wrote a book called Democracy in America and not of the representative regime in America. That is like, you are precisely, I think one of the and I think the listeners probably have already understood, you are an endangered species in a way because you are a storyteller and you are an amazing storyteller, Walter. And that's where I wanted to get because I started
Sure.
to find a thread actually in your work, and I think there are three essential aspects in your work. The first one, and we'll talk about that, is you write a lot about AI, even long before AI came into being, actually. And I think
Yes.
all your work, including Up in the Air, probably your most famous novel, is in a way about AI. I think Up in the Air is a book about AI, actually.
You're
Uh,
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It was published in 2001. It was made into the movie with George Clooney in 2010. But that movie did not really represent the preoccupation of the novel with the replacement of real experience with artificial experience.
Well, and what I think is it was mesmerizing, almost an illumination reading all your work while I was preparing for the interview. It's like, I mean, really, I think all good stories are about AI. I mean, should be about AI now today. And even I was thinking about, for example, my probably one of my favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey, and the move from Bedford Falls to Pottersville. I think it is also a story about AI. And it's extremely present in your work, and you were talking about it at length in the podcast you co-hosted with Matt Taibbi,
Yeah.
America This Week, which was my favorite podcast. I feel like
It just ended this week under murky and mysterious circumstances. But the real story of why it ended is that I was just an employee of that podcast, and a lot of decisions were out of my hands that were made there, which ultimately weren't very good for me. And so it was time that I moved on.
well, I mean, today, I mean, I must say I feel a little bit like if my parents divorced yesterday. So,
It's not as bad as your parents' divorce because it will not cut as deep, and it won't give you an emotional disease later in life. It's sad for both Matt and I that it ended, but I think he had other ambitions for his company, and because it was part of a larger Substack, a larger company, and I think I was ready for some new challenges.
well, I mean, I hope, I mean, we will hear a lot more from you, and a lot more, I mean, of like, I mean, that whole
Yeah,
type of discussion in which you're so good at. There
yeah,
is a second aspect of your work which came as also as an illumination as I was working on that interview is how I mean there is something, it's leitmotiv in your work, is how the forces that are behind AI are actually corrupting us by flattering our desire to be part of an exclusive group. And I think it's also very much the theme of Lost in the Meritocracy, and it's incredible how that's present in your work.
you're absolutely right. The great seduction that is used on contemporary man in order to give him the sense that he is making progress rather than forsaking uh, his role in the world
Hmm.
is that he's going to be smarter, more involved, and as you say, closer to an elite status. Now, in Up in the Air, and in anyone's life who's involved with airlines, there is a there is a game that's played,
Mm-hmm.
and that the more you fly, the more elite you will become, the more points you will get. Your card will turn from silver to gold
Mm-hmm.
to platinum. They do it with credit cards too. And you will even be able to get on the plane before the other people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that is for me is a metaphor for the way that we are seduced into a kind of corporate version of reality that is false, artificial, lonesome, very lonely, but we think will flatter the ego. The ego is being led down a path, and the body is being left behind. The senses, the spirit, and all the other things that make us human are being sacrificed for these little treats, these little appetizers
Mm-hmm.
to the ego.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's like again, that's such a leitmotif in your work, and precisely it's connected to a third big aspect of your work, which is more hopeful. Is you try to conjurate that kind of that I mean air world, as you call it actually in up in the air by looking for the I mean becoming some kind of archaeologist of the human in like the most unlikely places on earth. I mean I'm just gonna give a couple of places. I mean from
Okay.
your articles in County Highway. Places like Orderville in Utah, or some Basque restaurant in Elko, Nevada, or the Museum of Clean in Pocatello, Idaho. That these are the kind of places where you write about in County Highway, and you write absolutely precisely the kind of articles which mean are would explain why Tocqueville thought that mean he was seeing an authentic democracy in front of him actually. So
Well,
maybe.
well, well, saying that I represent the virtues that de Tocqueville found in America is probably the greatest compliment anyone has given me this far in my life. I mean, uh, and I thank you for that. And frankly, it's not an accident that I at least aspire to incarnate those virtues because I was raised in a small town in America where they were prized.
Mhm,
They might not have been lived out by people, but the goal was to have a small, interdependent community of individuals who were truly individuals, but who came together for the big challenges and who, one of de Tocqueville's conclusions about America was that these voluntary um, these voluntary assemblies that Americans make into
mhm,
groups to solve problems, and to sort of lighten the burden of being a vulnerable individual are the essence of our society. And they used to be. And in that town, those little institutions, the Lutheran church, even though I
mhm,
wasn't a Lutheran, the little bar where everyone went to play games, play pool and play darts, the county hall where to support the fire department, there was a big dance
mhm.
every October. And all those institutions, those voluntary small assemblies, were intact when I was a child. And so uh, they infected me with that spirit. And that was the same spirit that de Tocqueville discovered even 100 years ago, traveling America. I'm not sure they're intact anymore,
Mhm.
but but and I don't write just about longing for them. I write about what was lost and the way the spirit that created them in the first place is trying to find a way again. It's not dead, it's just homeless.
And it's so funny because it's like you are also a Midwestern, and that's an extremely important part of your identity. And and all the people who actually in whom I found these virtues of American democracy are Midwestern, and not only you are Midwestern, but you are Minnesotan, like another
Yes.
famous writer, Scott Fitzgerald, and among others. And it's like, I think the Midwestern have played a big role actually in I think in the reason why I decided to become naturalized as an American. And
Why? I'm curious.
in fact, my conversion to America came from Christopher Lasch, who is also who was a
One of my favorite sociologists, journalists, and observers of humanity, Christopher Lasch. Yeah.
and Lasch actually was came from Nebraska actually, and he all his life claimed the identity of a Midwestern, and that was very important for him. And I wrote a book actually on Christopher Lasch, which is some kind of reference book in French. So it's like it's really thanks to the reading of Christopher Lasch, I came to read people like Wendell Berry. I discovered you after, but you belong in that kind of vein of American, which basically I was like, this is a tribe I'm willing to be part of, and I have planted my roots in America. I live in the DC area, as you know. But the Midwestern are a very important part of my conversion to America. So I'm always
I'll, I'll,
pleased.
te- I'll tell you something interesting about that. You mentioned one famous American Minnesota
Mm-hmm,
writer, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who left the Midwest for adventures in places like Paris and the south of France and New York City and so on, and who felt that he had kind of lost his way and really writes about the corruption of the
mm-hmm,
Midwesterner. But there is another Minnesota writer who actually was the first American, I think, to win the Nobel Prize in literature,
mm-hmm.
Sinclair Lewis.
Of course. Mm-hmm,
And Sinclair Lewis was the opposite of you and the opposite of me in some ways.
mm-hmm,
He was from a small Minnesota town, and his first breakthrough, best-selling, famous book was called Main Street. And it was about the narrowness of the Midwest and the sort of stupidity of it. And it was about a young woman who comes to sort of lift the cultural life of a small town and fails because everybody is so stupid and obsessed with money and intellectually stunted. And Lewis did a very good job, though I love his work for various other reasons, of making America ashamed of the things that
mm-hmm.
Tocqueville had celebrated. And I think that later now in history, we can see that Lewis was wrong in some ways. That what he thought was the unexciting, bourgeois,
Mm-hmm.
narrow-minded stupidity of the small communities and of the Midwestern communities, what was a mistaken reading of something else, which was humanity, modesty, and community.
Yes, and in fact, it's funny because Sinclair Lewis is one of the big villain of one of the books of Christopher Lasch, The True and Only Heaven.
I
Um,
didn't know that.
and yeah, among Sinclair Lewis, particularly H.R. Mencken, and Richard Hofstadter, who was actually Christopher Lasch's mentor, and really, it's really a long history of he has particularly a chapter called the civilized minority, where you have long analysis about. Walter Lippmann as well is one of the big villain of Christopher Lasch, True and Only Heaven. So that's and in fact these people are really iconic in the way the current elite think of itself and the way it views the Middle American in
A-
particular.
Absolutely. For the current elite, the preferred path for a what they call a middle American. And that in itself is an insult because they're not high, they're not low, they're in the boring middle. For the current elite, you're supposed to leave your small town, you're supposed to leave the Midwest, you're supposed to leave the regional home where you grew up. You're supposed to go out to a major university or a big city on the East Coast, and there you become sophisticated, and there you rejoin the great European cosmopolitan stream of thinking and politics and so on. Um, Maybe you later try to reform those people that you came from, or you try to correct them. But if you can't correct them, you override them because, like Walter Lippmann, the great American journalist, but I think mistaken American
Hmm.
journalist, you believe that they need, like farm animals, maybe, to be led along and to be cured of what supposedly is their natural prejudice and selfishness and so on.
It's funny you mentioned animals. It's like me because your column in County Highway is called "When Animals Attack," and it is a column which is a column about the elite in a way. It's and I think it's
No one has seen that but you. No one has seen that but you. When animals attack are stories of real animal attacks.
Mhm.
They are actual animal attacks that have taken place. But I use them as and I twist them a little bit into allegories about politics, society, and so on. But I usually end up on the side of the animal, almost always
Always.
sympathetic to the animal's point of view in the attack. And that is a way of saying I'm sympathetic to the people who are treated like animals in our society. It's a way of what they say, um, uh, sympathizing with the underdog.
Yes, and that is really a distinctive trait of Christopher Lash and all interesting Midwestern authors again that I have read, and it is constant in County Highway. I think it is really the tone of County Highway. I mean, pretty much all articles in County Highway are first of all it's extremely well written. I mean, and
Well, that's the trick. We
yeah.
stand up for the places that others ignore, but we write about them with more sophistication,
Mhm.
more literary acumen, more density of allusion and reference than even in the New Yorker.
Maybe Walter, you can tell us because we were starting to talk about like I mean various encounters with the elite and you recently worked on a big project which is a script screenplay on the COVID. Well, in fact, I mean,
Yes, yes,
maybe it's called the rush, and maybe you can tell us more and where you are heading with this.
right. Well, so the COVID hysteria, and I will assert that we overreacted terribly to COVID, and that in many ways, economically, socially, even medically, we harmed ourselves pretty badly and out of proportion to the threat. A threat which is still hard to know if it was just exaggerated or
Mhm.
completely made up. Um, uh, and it reminded me of the kind of hysteria in the 50s surrounded, anti-communism, that
Mhm.
surrounded the fear of, communist infiltrators. It was very similar because it involved in-groups and elites having suspicions about regular people. It involved a lot of censorship. It involved a lot of mutual accusations and distrust between individuals. And what I felt was that COVID has not been properly reckoned with or digested as a dramatic phenomenon, as a drama of humans versus humans. You know, we used to be very good at that in America and throughout the West. We would take we would take things like the nuclear standoff between Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States, and we'd turn them into movies like Doctor Strangelove, and we'd satirize them, and you know, and we were very good in the United States after the Vietnam War of examining it spiritually and dramatically in movies like Apocalypse Now, say, or whatever. But we have, as of this date, not done the same thing with the pandemic. We haven't really looked at what was universal and fundamental about how people were manipulated at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
In the rash, it's not really about COVID. It's about another disease, a rash that causes people to scratch themselves. And as they scratch themselves, they don't know if they're causing the rash or reacting to it. But various parts of society, the pharmaceutical industry, governments, see an opportunity here for the extension of their own power. And that is what the movie's about. It's a satire. It's kind of a dark comedy, but it's also based on it's really based on one American scientist, Jay Bhattacharya,
Mm-hmm.
who
Of course.
was at Stanford University, and he had reached some conclusions about COVID that he thought were would be very interesting for the wider society. He found out it was much wider spread earlier than people thought. So there really wasn't any use in closing schools and closing businesses. He also found out that since so many had had it, that the death rate was much lower than the politicians were saying. So he's saying it's already spread everywhere. There's not much you can do about it, number one. And number two, it's not that deadly.
Mm-hmm.
And when he announced these findings, he was a professor at Stanford University. The whole world came and was hostile to him because he had upset an operation to basically scare and re-engineer society around this virus. And so the predicament of the man who is rational, sane, and trying to convince his family, his university, his town of the truth when they don't want to hear it because they're in the grips of a an architecture for control is an old theme. The one sane person in an insane world. That's supposed to be a story that Americans love.
Mm.
It's like Gary Cooper in High Noon, going out onto the street alone because everyone's either a coward or corrupt or scared, or terrified to do justice. And I saw in that story of Bhattacharya, who I did research. It's not based on him, but his experience was great for me to create a character. Uh, and so I hope this movie gets made. It's in the process of attracting investors, and we have attracted a lot of money, and I think it will get made. But I think it will be the first drama that I'm aware of, which truly, uh, which truly investigates, explores what we went through during COVID, even though it's not about COVID itself.
Yeah, there is also another movie which came out fairly recently called Eddington by Ari Aster.
Yes,
I think you're probably familiar with it, but it's not as well though. I mean, it's quite a comedy as well. But
right,
you
right.
described the Rush as a the Doctor Strangelove of the COVID. Actually, that is.
It's Doctor Strangelove meets a Frank Capra
Mhm.
movie. a movie like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, by the same director of It's a
Wonderful
Wonderful
Life. Yeah.
Life, is the story of someone who has a lot of ideals, illusions, who comes from a small town, believes that America is good, its ideals are sound, its constitution is wonderful. He gets to Washington and he's surrounded by a media which tells lies, other politicians who pretend to be one thing and of course are another. They're politicians. What
Yeah.
else? What else would they do? And he's almost defeated. He's almost defeated, but he wins in the end because I think the belief, the optimism that's almost incurable in America
Yeah.
it is Capra's theme. And he's not just being a fantasy artist, he's telling us that it's possible, that it's actually possible. And the story of Mr. Bhattacharya, of Dr. Bhattacharya, also tells us it's possible. Because when I met him, it was 2024, and it was on the Stanford campus. And he was just a man who'd been through this COVID period and this professional conflict over his findings about COVID. But now he is the director of the National Institutes of Health for the entire United States. He is in charge of the research money that's spent on medicine and medical research in the whole country.
Hmm.
That is a Frank Capra
That is
story.
a Frank Capra story. I mean, in fact, it's too good to be true because I mean, I think you say that in fact, he was almost too good to be actually cast as your real hero in the Rush.
It's why I could only use part of his
Hmm.
experience in the movie because it is poetic justice to the zillionth degree. And one thing we know about modern audiences is they're very suspicious of poetic
Oh, yes.
justice. They don't think it can happen.
Interesting you are talking about Bhattacharya as well because I think it's a perfect transition. In fact, I just wrote a piece for Brownstone Institute actually about that roundtable we were both at where Jay Bhattacharya was presenting his vision for the NIH. And
Yes.
what struck me is I think Bhattacharya has this quality of precisely a new kind of elite with common decency. To
Yes.
borrow the term from Orwell, and it was absolutely striking. First of all, I mean, I think he was genuinely humble, acknowledging. I mean, for one of the very first time, I didn't have a scientist in front of me speaking like a demiurge. It was, I mean, absolutely mesmerizing. So I got inspired in writing a little piece. He truly is like a Frank Capra hero. But to make a transition from like, I mean,
Yes.
precisely that elite, which I mean, it displaying a kind of noblesse oblige, a common decency, and well, that other elite, which not so much. In a way, I'm kind of. I mean, the reason I wrote that article is that I wanted to focus on, like, I mean, on a something hopeful in the person
Yes.
of Bhattacharya, as opposed to the rot we are actually witnessing with the whole Epstein case. So maybe, I mean, I wanted to get your take
What I think about the Epstein case.
about what is going on, and that contrast maybe this Maha elite and
Right. Well, okay, number one, you should know that after Jeffrey Epstein died mysteriously in his jail cell, I wrote an editorial for the New York Times. It was published just a couple of days later,
Mhm,
saying there's so much more to this story. I'm not sure that he died in under the circumstances we're being told he died
mhm.
under. The New York Times doesn't want to let conspiracy theories into its pages, but it let a lot of skepticism from me into its pages about Epstein because I think even it knew that there was much more to the story. Now, as all of this correspondence and legal documentation is being released, we're starting to get a picture of who this man really was, but more importantly, how the elites really operate,
Mm.
not just in America, but across the Atlantic and around the world. And it's an absolutely terrifying picture because they're not only are they obsessed with kind of you know pedophilia, with sex with young people, they're obsessed with science and with there is a lot of mm, there are a lot of intellectuals and scientists in his circle, and they're discussing very, very superficially what we might call transhumanism. Um, and they are obviously people who believe that they are going into a future where they will be masters
Hmm.
and and where the little people like me and you and everybody else and will be left behind. It's not necessarily a story of criminals anymore.
Hmm.
It's a story of a network of Ubermenschen
Hmm.
who believe at least that they are such and who believe that they can gratify themselves, that they can satisfy their lusts in whatever way they care to, because somehow they have transcended the human. They're a bunch of demons. They are Dostoevsky characters.
Hmm.
They are people who think of themselves as having left behind regular morality and as having achieved a kind of Gnostic transcendence of the rules that the rest of us follow. In a way, I mean, it's like a crazy version of Proust. We're seeing lit up the whole social circle that runs things and the beautiful world, the beau monde, but it's ugly beyond belief.
Well, in fact, I mean, Christopher Lash had written something which I think is worth revisiting or rereading now, where he was actually saying that in fact that might this phenomenon might go back very far. Probably at the origin of liberal modernity. And
Yes.
Lash was saying that basically you have the Dark Lord of liberal modernity who was the Marquis de Sade. And the Marquis de Sade, for Lash, had envisioned what was the end, was going to be the end of liberal modernity, and I think we are at that moment. And that world he had imagined was some kind of sexual utopia, where everybody has the right to offer himself or herself. I mean, as an object of sexual exchange. Actually, it's
And it's true. They are sadists.
mhm.
They are they are disciples of Assad, whether they know it or not. They are people who delighted in inflicting pain on weaker beings. That's what they finally decided was the great drug, the great gratification, and was their common pursuit. And it's terrifying because they are the people who were in charge and maybe still are in charge in many ways.
But at the same time, I'm a little concerned about this story because a lot of people put so much hope in it, and they think it's really the moment of liberation from precisely that elite. And I think this might be a delusion, and I think it's like, I mean, at the same time, what I fear is dangerous is that belief that okay, we need to purge that kind of like, I mean, that kind of sadist elite that we have,
Right.
that is like, I mean, now being revealed by that Epstein case, but then everything will go back to normal. We will liberal modernity will resume its course, and I think the reality is a little bit more sinister than this. I think we have our part to play in this.
There is a belief in mankind, or maybe you could call it Western mankind, but I think all mankind, that that catharsis, that realization, crisis, and redemption is possible and can be earned simply by knowing the truth. In other words, if you're in Freudian psychoanalysis, you will, by becoming conscious of your conflicts, you can liberate yourself
Mm-hmm.
from them. In, uh, in Christianity, by knowing and confessing sin, you can be redeemed. In law, you can have a trial, and the truth is found, and society is purged. We have to think that, or else we really wouldn't have any hope for a moral society. But you're right. To be deluded into believing it will come easily or that it will come in a wide way and or in a significant way such that it will actually change society or government is to set yourself up for a disappointment that could be disastrous. Because if you are over optimistic about the possibility of catharsis and catharsis and redemption and relief are not achieved or not achieved easily or widely or quickly, you might then become almost a wild animal in your either your depression, you just sink into a feeling of despair,
Mm-hmm.
or in your savagery when you go, there's no use going through the processes anymore. We just have to take it into our own hands. We have to lash out, give up the rules, revert to the the jungle and make things better for ourselves in some violent way. Out of those alternatives, despair or violence, I think despair is more likely. Despair and cynicism are more likely because few people have the power, even in any combination with others, to achieve these kind of revolutions that might happen. So, to realize the truth and then to realize you're powerless
Mm-hmm.
and society is
Condition.
powerless to address it, that there won't be a Nuremberg trial,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or even there's a question of whether the actual Nuremberg trials were even as significant as we pretend they are. A lot of the bad guys got away. But in any case, to be disappointed in this process in the end could be dangerous. And in this sense, I think Christians who know that justice is something that happens on an other plane and is directed by another kind of being, they might be wise to stick with that because I agree with you. I don't think satisfaction is going to be had just because we have revelation.
Which is a very dangerous. It could be a really slippery slope. I mean, and
I don't know enough about it,
yeah.
and but up to say, but I will tell you that it reminds me of conditions before the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Where you find out that your aristocracy is, hollow and self-serving and corrupt. But I don't think the conditions that obtain now in society will lead to the same kind of revolution. I think they'll lead to a, a collapse of morale.
Mm-hmm. Talking about collapse of more, maybe a transition to another topic is, I mean, I don't think French people are very very often hear a Minnesotan talking, and that is also another quite messy place right now, the state of
Yes,
Minnesota.
yes,
And maybe you can tell us, because it feels like it's like the congruence of so many phenomena. I mean, you have like, I mean,
yes.
Tim Walz. I mean, he's probably the most kind of like, I mean, ridiculous and concerning politician. on. You have, like, I mean, it was the summer of 2020. Then you have
The
the
George Floyd,
Somali,
yes, the
the
George Floyd
George
riots.
Floyd, the George Floyd. Then you have the Somalian scandal, and you have the now the feud between the federal government and the Democratic-led cities, of which Minnesota and Minneapolis is the epicenter. So, I mean, you had that strange murder in June of the Speaker of the House of Minnesota. I mean, it's like me. So, what is going on in Minnesota?
Well, okay, Minnesota, when I grew up there, was a very intact society.
Mm-hmm.
It's ethnically Scandinavian. It's settled mostly by Swedes, Norwegians, and Germans, okay? But it also has two big cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis. And in this big state of farms, and then in the north, mines, where a lot of Eastern Europeans and Slovakians and so on worked in the mines, you have these big modern cities with Fortune 500 corporations and multi-ethnic with rich uh, suburbs and poor interiors, poor centers. Um, that was a balance that was still intact and not crazy when I was young. But it's a also a one-party state now. The Democratic Party, which calls itself the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, there has almost sole control of the legislature and the governorship and other things. And it has created a political machine that is as corrupt as any in
Mm.
America. And one thing that that machine has been able to do is redirect money that comes from the federal government through immigrant businesses like daycares and
Mm.
medical transport services and clinics for the autistic child and so on, and basically rob the people, or at least the government, of billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. And the politicians seem to have been in on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the immigration into the state, which was so sudden, particularly from the from Somalia, seems to have been used as a vehicle, an instrument for this corruption. I doubt that the Somalis get to keep all those billions of dollars
Mm-hmm.
themselves. I very much doubt that. I very much doubt that they're just a very cunning little group of immigrants who managed to, you know, game the system profitably. I think, and because my county highway newspaper reported on deeply, I can say confidently that in concert with a political machine, they perfected
Mm-hmm.
a method for taking social welfare money uh, and liberal virtues and the belief in doing the right thing and turned it into a kind of mafia and into a kind of form of organized crime much more profitable than prostitution and much more profitable than gambling, much more profitable than drugs. And the question is whether this example we're seeing of this method, of this paradigm in Minnesota is not also shared everywhere else. And I think it is. I think what we're seeing in Minnesota is a crystalline uh, um, example of a way of robbing a country of its wealth,
Mm-hmm.
of stealing, that is widely practiced everywhere and probably worse. But for some reason, Minnesota, because it's smaller, it's more controlled by one party, and because I think mm, it represented once in America a kind of purity
Mm-hmm.
or a kind of goodness or Midwestern simplicity. Minnesota is the stage for realizing this. And it's shocking. It's shocking,
Yeah,
especially for someone who grew up there.
yeah. I think the slogan of Minnesota was "Minnesota nice," precisely, and
Beware of nice people, right? I mean, because the facade, the face of Minnesota, even when I was a child, or when Sinclair Lewis was writing about it,
hmm,
there was hypocrisy. There were self-serving people. It was never the perfect world because there is none that some people might have idealized,
mhm.
but it was pretty good and it functioned pretty well. And the myths were largely, largely and substantially correct, but it has been inverted, turned upside down, turned inside out in a way that takes my breath away. I mean, I don't even want to go back there.
Hmm. You still have family in Minnesota?
Well, my family, its deep roots are in the state of Ohio,
Hmm.
but my father and mother moved when I was a young child to Minnesota, so we grew up there. Both my father and mother are dead now. I still have a brother there who works in the Twin Cities, but I don't have really any family ties other than that. So I'm able to look at Minnesota a little coldly, as I do have to go through the Minneapolis airport all the time when I
Hmm.
fly from Montana east, but that's all the association I want with the place anymore.
You mentioned your father. I just like in this perfect transition because I wanted to read you a quote from Lost in Meritocracy, actually, which is illustrative of a phenomenon I wanted to discuss with you. This is the quote. My father had a spell. He quit 3M. He decided America's future lay out west, moved the family to Phoenix in a U-Haul, flew off to Tampa to watch his own dad die, lost weight, lost his marbles, opened the yellow pages, turned to a page headed churches, and called the Mormons. I thought it was an extraordinary picture of a kind of life which is I mean singularly uniquely American, which is like I mean that kind of restlessness.
Yes,
It's like I mean which all Americans I mean experience, but at the same time I don't think it's the kind of restlessness that's in germ with the empire, with the elite, the imperial
right.
elite. It's maybe you can expand on this. That was a beautiful
Well,
part.
so my father worked for the international company 3M,
Hmm.
Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, the people who make Scotch tape and post-it notes and all those things. He was a chemical engineer. He then became a patent lawyer.
Hmm.
And so he defended the intellectual property of this company. And we lived in a little town of 500 people, and he commuted to that office in St. Paul. But he decided in 1976 that he was meant for bigger things, and that he was a kind of noble savage who had been constrained by corporate life, and we were going to move to the frontier. And in 1976, Phoenix, Arizona was to some extent the frontier.
Mm.
It was a much, much smaller city than it is now. It was way out in the desert. It didn't have the kind of cosmopolitan polish of other places. And so we packed up all our things, put them in a truck, and drove everything we had, our beds, our furniture, and ourselves down to Phoenix, Arizona. Well, the problem was he didn't really have a job there, but he thought that hunting quail and fishing for trout in the
Mm.
mountains and all that was more important than having a good job. He he's tried to find inventors who he could represent legally and get paid by in Phoenix, but they all turned out to be crazy. They were people who had invented little pyramids that created mystical power or things like that, and they actually didn't have the money to pay him, but someday they would when they were rich from their invention. And he started going crazy. But he literally was a pioneer in the sense that he moved from a very stable metropolitan job in St. Paul, Minnesota, with a Fortune 500 international corporation, and just got in the car and took us all to the desert, to a new city without those big corporate roots, without any real deep social roots,
Mm.
that was growing quickly, but just of people like him who are just showing up in their
Yeah.
cars, wanting cheaper housing and, bigger horizons. And in a weird way, it didn't work. It just didn't work. It was delusion. He thought he was Hemingway. He thought he was, Daniel Boone or some early American pioneer, and he couldn't make any money.
Well, and I mean, but you mentioned in precisely one word, which I think is also a topic I wanted to talk to discuss with you. Intellectual property. You
Yes.
recently interviewed for a very prestigious job, actually, in the federal administration for to become Librarian of Congress, and apparently
Well,
it's yeah.
somebody suggested to me, somebody who had government experience, that it would be a great job for me. And then other people around the Trump administration and in it encouraged me to pursue it and said they might like me to actually become that librarian. And the job is simple. You administer this vast collection of American
Hmm.
books, movies, recordings that is housed in a beautiful old building from the early 19th century. The library itself began as Thomas Jefferson's private library,
Hmm.
which he sold to the United States in the early 1800s, and which was added to over the years. And my father was a patent and copyright attorney. He protected the rights of inventors, but also the rights of authors and so on. And I thought it would be wonderful to take this job. So I actually applied for it.
Mm.
I called federal officials and talked to them about it and discussed my interest in it. And I got encouragement from other people who I thought were powerful, but then nothing. And then the current Librarian of Congress was fired by Donald Trump.
Mm.
And when when he tried to replace the librarian with somebody who wasn't me, the current staff wouldn't acknowledge this person. So it was sort of like when, there are two people who both want the throne, or both want to be king, and there's a dispute over who is legitimate. And so for a while, there are two capitals. And right now, there is no real Librarian of Congress in America. And the reason, I think, is that in the AI age,
Mm.
there is a desire on the part of industry to take all these books, all these movies, and so on, and give them to the AI as training material.
Mm.
But you see, in the way America is set up, the Librarian of Congress has certain duties to protect copyright and and the discretion to protect it aggressively. And I don't think someone who was aggressive in the protection of copyrights and authorial privileges and so on would be welcome
Mm.
right now in a period when we feel, and many feel, that feeding the AI is the most important priority for national security, prosperity, and so on. So I don't think I really suited the moment.
No, and in fact, that's it's very interesting, but it's also very nefarious. That's like, I mean, that whole push of AI to actually to capture the entire. I mean, because I think the Library of Congress publishes pretty much everything that is published in the world. That I mean, stocks
Well,
everything is published in the world. Mm.
yes, stocks it. Yes, they take a copy.
Mm.
Um, it used to be a physical copy. Maybe sometimes now it's just a digital copy, but it is one of the world's largest libraries. And you see, one of the reasons I was interested in the job is that one of my great literary heroes, Jorge Luis Borges
Mm-hmm.
of Argentina,
Of course.
was himself a national librarian.
Mm,
He was the equivalent of the Librarian of Congress in Argentina.
mm,
And he was a man, a legendary writer and a great writer, who I met in person at the very end of his life. I was at Oxford University in 1984. I studied at Oxford after I studied at Princeton in the US. And I saw a little note card one day on a bulletin board in our college that Senor Borges wanted to speak to students about literature. I didn't even know he was still alive. It was like hearing that James Joyce or Samuel Beckett was visiting the college. And so I ran down to a certain room, and there came this old blind master of 20th century literature. And it was like being struck by artistic lightning to speak to him.
mm,
And one of the reasons I wanted to be this Librarian of Congress was I wanted to emulate him as a protector,
mm.
as a protector of the American intellectual legacy and literary legacy.
And it's you talk really abundantly about AI. This is really an enormous concern for you, beyond simply like the fact that it wants to capture the entire.
It's a huge concern for me
Mm,
because I think that the technologists, the engineers, and even most citizens are mistaken about the nature of literary products produced by AI. Let me not talk about
mhm,
the general destabilization of society and the loss of jobs and all the other things that it will probably lead to, but just talk about the production of literature or words or journalism by it. It has no experience. It has no experience of life. It is a math formula which is creating plausible simulations or recreations of literary works based on robbing the graves
mm.
in a Dr. Frankenstein fashion and putting together the pieces according to algebraic models. But it has never been anywhere. It has never had its heart broken. It's never loved anything, and it doesn't live in the anxiety that creates literature, which is the anxiety about dying and disappearing.
It,
AI will only be, in any sense, a being when it has to contemplate its own extinction. But it never will, because it will be created to be immortal and ever growing, which is not what you and I as human beings have to deal with
mm.
every moment. And thus the artistic products of AI are radically insufficient to the human condition. Why do we want to read the experience? Why do we want to read literature written by a machine that has never loved, never had fear, never experienced the cold or the hot or the heat?
Mm.
And once we start training our own minds on it, once its products become our guides to life, then we are in a perverse and, I think, catastrophic situation because we are now following a map created by an entity or a machine that has never been to the places we live in and have to go in the heart, in physical reality, in spiritual and intellectual reality. We are listening to a monster for advice or stories about how to live. And just because they were derived from stories that were created by humans doesn't mean they have any resemblance to the ones we could tell. We're going to stop telling our own stories because this thing has replaced it.
Hmm.
And we will, because it will write a novel much more cheaply than any human author, much more quickly, much more easily. So we will stop being creative in the traditional way. We will stop observing our own situation. We will stop inspecting our own emotions. We will stop respecting our own experience in favor of a false God.
In fact, you have we both share a passion for a particular dystopian novel. It's C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength, which you commented
Yes,
on America
yes,
this week with
yes.
Matt Taibbi. And there is one particularly frightening moment is when Mark, the main character, is actually locked in a room with grotesquely disproportionate form, and it's a training. His jailers are telling him that it's a training in perfect objectivity. And then he has precisely that's I mean that's when I mean Lewis is such a genius, because he has this reaction which he said but after an hour or so, this long high coffin of a room began to produce on Mark an effect which his instructor had probably not anticipated. There was no return of the attack which he had suffered last night in the cell, whether because he had already survived that attack or because the imminence of death had drawn the tooth of his lifelong desire for the esoteric, or because he had, in a fashion, called very urgently for help. The beyond and painted perversity of this room had the effect of making him aware, as he had never been aware before, of this room's opposite. As the desert first teaches man to love water, or as absence first reveals affection, there rose up against this background of the sour and the crooked some kind of vision of the sweet and the straight, something else, something he vaguely called the normal. And I think it's this is an amazing. This is what you are trying to do precisely in your articles in County Highway.
Yes, yes.
When you go to a Basque joint in Elko, Nevada, that is, yeah.
Exactly. And let me tell you, for anybody who's, anybody who's from Europe or hasn't been to America or hasn't been to a place like Nevada, go to Elko, Nevada, go to the Star Restaurant, and don't be slow about going because it might not exist for very long. And to me, it is the epicenter of the normal, the human, the sort of salty and the real. And when I tried to evoke it, I was trying to do what was just described by Lewis, which was give you the experience of the normal, whose value you are only suddenly realizing because you have seen its opposite. You have seen its rival. You have seen its adversary. Its adversary. You see, there's a book, I can't pronounce French words. The writer's name, Emmanuel Carrère,
Oh,
I
of
think.
course, Emmanuel Carrère is one of my favorite alive writers. I mean, definitely,
Right.
yeah,
And he wrote a book called The Adversary,
yes.
L'Adversaire,
Mm.
which was like my book about a murderer and a man who had fooled everyone, pretended to be a doctor. It's the only book that influenced mine. The only book. Strangely, when I was writing Blood Will Out,
Hmm.
a Swiss tourist came by and I started talking to him, and I told him I was a writer, and he asked me what I was doing, a stranger, and I said I'm writing a book about this con artist and so on, and who killed people, and he said that sounds a lot like the book The Adversary by Emmanuel Carrère. I said I've never heard of it, but I'm going to read it, and that book, more than any other, influenced mine. It's the only one that had really any influence at all because I didn't know, and that book is about the abnormal. It's about human evil. But But AI evil is of a different kind.
mm,
And even in the Lewis book, I think he prefers, he makes a distinction between human evil and this inhuman, scientific, perfectly objective form of evil. And in a way, maybe we will become human for the first time when we fully confront the adversary.
mm,
Maybe we will only appreciate our situation and our composition when we see its mirror image, its dark mirror image. But I would rank that hideous strength even above
mm,
1984 or Brave New World for appreciating the spiritual nature, the deep nature of our predicament. It's not a political predicament. It is an existential predicament. It is a spiritual, it is a cosmic predicament to make a copy of yourself and have that copy become more powerful
mm.
than the original, such that the original is the subject of the copy. How long can we live in that relationship? What will happen if we don't become aware of it? And in that hideous strength, there's a rebellion at the end. I mean, all the animals of the world come into the
Yeah.
room. Elephants
Mm,
come in, actual elephants, to fight this group which supports this machine, this system, and they win. The old ghosts of England and the old Arthurian characters come
Merlin,
back to
yeah.
life,
Yeah.
and there's an alliance between the elephant and the Arthurian
Mm.
uh, knight that defeats this. It's an interesting alliance. The animalism of humanity, which you would think a theologian like Lewis might be uncomfortable with, is celebrated
Mm.
in its triumph over the cold, objective, meaningless spirit without spirit.
Well, just to mention that that group of academic is actually called NICE, that
Right,
institution
right.
which
Yes.
harbors these
Nice.
demonic people. Actually, this is it.
It's an acronym, the something National Institute of something.
Yeah, I forgot the exact meaning of the acronym, but it's again. I really think it's probably the most important dystopian novel, and it's I think for particularly since it was written in 1943 actually, so
Yes.
it's really a tour de force. And that mean
It anticipated what we call technocracy.
Mhm, completely. It is the novel about technocracy. It is
Yeah.
the novel about about all these forces we talked about at the beginning. And in fact, I think it's a very good point to conclude our conversation. Although I wish
Well,
I could stay.
let's conclude only this chapter because I'd like to rendezvous at certain stages in the next maybe year, maybe in a few
That's
months,
like mean you made
so
my
that so
day, Walter.
well, because now we've set the stage,
Mm.
people know who I am, and
Oh.
I know who you are,
Mm.
and I understand what you're interested in, and I would like to see
Oh.
a little later in the play how we feel about it.
Of
And
course. I mean, whenever you want. I mean, you will be.
okay.
I mean, it's like I mean, you really made my day today by concluding like
Well,
that.
and I have learned a lot because let me tell you, I mean, I don't want to sound like an American jackass, but the French intellectual tradition has created a subtlety of observation and criticism that I don't think exists otherwise. And it is such a privilege to be in its
Uh,
company and to be in conversation with someone who embodies that uh, aptitude that I have to do it again.
Well, Walter, you mean I'm so flattered because I mean it's like I return the compliment. I mean you're a great American again. I mean that's like I mean you are I mean it's because of you of people like you I have like I mean become an American myself actually. So
Well, welcome to the ship. You know, my old Hungarian ancestors and all the people who struggled over here, you know, in the dark parts of the oceanic vessels. We got here a little earlier, but we took the same passage, and I'm happy that we're together here.
well, we'll talk about your origin as well next
Yeah.
time. Thank you again, Walter. That was wonderful.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.